All moral beings have essentially the same rights and duties, whether they be male or female. If we women have no right to act, then we may well be termed the white slaves of the North. For like our brethren in bonds, we must seal our lips in silence and despair. Angelina Grimke, 1837.
In the early years after the United States was founded, America was a promised land for some. They came with empty pockets, worked hard, bought land, built businesses. They had more say in their government than people of any other country in the world. They lived in a democracy, but more than half of America did not. Women, African Americans, and poor men of every race. This is the story of their struggle to be included. The work of the American revolutionaries and the writers of the Constitution broke traditions and raised eyebrows. Their call for reform was heard around the world. But now the country was moving on from its infancy to its childhood. America had become a different place than the America that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin knew. Could their democracy survive? Could the American government deliver on the promises contained in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution? Americans spent the early 1800s conquering the wilderness. They strung the countryside with railroad tracks and built a network of canals and roads, transporting people and products quickly and efficiently from farm to city, from region to region.
Let us then bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space. John Calhoun, 1821.
For some, growing businesses meant homes were filled with inexpensive machine-made goods, closets were filled with clothes, and time was set aside for rest and play.
More and more things that had never been available before are being bought. Households have store-bought clothing, store-bought furniture, store-bought food of various kinds, store-bought drink of all kinds of descriptions. And the household became a unit of consumption instead of a unit of production. And it began to resemble what we normally think of a modern household.
But for others, industrialization meant danger.
While trade is destined to free and employ the masses, it is also destined to destroy, for the time, much of the beauty and happiness of every land. We are free, but the excitement, the commercial activity, the restlessness to which the state of affairs has given birth is far from being a desirable or natural condition. Henry W. Bellows, 1845.
America was changing.
How were the American cities changing in the first half of the 1800s? Well, they were growing like mushrooms. They were teeming with new immigrants and people coming in from the countryside.
One of the things that began to happen in cities at this point, as there were more people in them, is that people began to see poverty in ways that they hadn't before.
Violence, people drinking too much alcohol, children wandering in the streets, homeless people. These aren't modern problems. These were the problems that came with the first great period of rapid urbanization. And immigrants were particularly different because they were coming from Ireland and from Germany, mostly in the first half of the 1800s.
The arrival of those peoples who spoke different languages was difficult for most Americans to deal with. We have a problem today, I think, dealing with people who are different. And that's not new. It really began in the middle of the 19th century.
What was happening to America? Was the American experiment failing? People started lifting their voices, demanding change. America had never seen a party like this before. Incoming President Andrew Jackson actually threw open the doors of the White House to an unruly mob that muddied the carpets, broke dishes, and stood on the furniture to catch a glimpse of the new president. People pushed and shoved to get a closer look at Jackson, who was forced to spend his first night in office in a nearby hotel. Jackson's inauguration day in 1829 became a symbol of the growing political power of the common man, an idea that delighted some and scared others. Although the Constitution begins with "We the people," it wasn't always clear who the people were. Women and African Americans were excluded, but so were many white men.
America did not begin as a democracy, as is commonly believed. There were property qualifications in every state after the American Revolution, so that one had to own property in order to vote in most states.
A growing number of Americans argued that this wasn't fair, that the poor should have a voice too.
There are various ways in which the rich may oppress the poor, in which property may oppress liberty, and that the world is filled with examples. It is necessary that the poor should have a defense against the danger. James Madison, 1820.
Unlike Madison, most of the Founding Fathers had feared the common man and built in means to limit who could vote, including the requirement of land ownership. But all of that was changing in the 1820s. Andrew Jackson was a self-made man.
He was born on the frontier in Tennessee. He was an orphan, in fact. Poor as a church mouse, who rose within the military, became a very successful soldier in the War of 1812.
Old Hickory, they called him. Tough as the hardest wood. He was fearless, rough and tumble, and had a violent temper. A different kind of leader than Americans were used to.
He wasn't afraid to wear muddy shoes into the White House and belt down shots of whiskey with the shabbiest looking person who might come down the street. So he typified the common man, and Americans loved him.
And he spoke for the farmers and frontiersmen, particularly in the South and West. When Jackson became president in 1829, he fought hard against the established United States government, headed by what he called professional politicians, eating at the hog trough, and taking rights away from the American people. He argued for states' rights and for less federal government. To curb special influence, he removed hundreds of federal office holders and killed the Bank of the United States, which he thought was favoring businessmen and politicians he called money power.
Many of our rich men have not been content with equal protection and equal benefits, but have besought us to make them richer by act of Congress. Andrew Jackson.
Jackson's bold use of presidential power won him many enemies and the nickname King Andrew I from opponents who thought he was acting like a king instead of a president. These opponents formed the Whig Party, a name used by English politicians who had fought against the abuses of the king. Swept by controversy, Andrew Jackson's presidency became the symbol of political changes that were sweeping the nation.
A movement developed to extend the vote, partly through agitation on the part of people who wanted the vote, and partly on the part of reformers who thought that the nation should fulfill its democratic destiny. So after 1815 or so, and into the 1840s, state after state after state rewrites its constitution. And in rewriting its constitution, generally speaking, more and more men gain the right to vote. In other words, property qualifications are eliminated.
On the other hand, no women were being able to vote, and this increased the distinction between women and men. Because before there had been all women and some men who couldn't vote, and now suddenly all white men could vote and no women could vote.
As white men, poor white men, were gaining the vote, free black men in America were losing the vote. They had voted in most of the northern states, but in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, the northern states were revising their constitutions and stripping away the right of free African Americans to vote. That reflected the growing racial tension in the North. between free blacks and free whites.
Many Americans questioned their government on these inequalities and in other areas of life. Hand in hand with political change came new ways of thinking about religion, slavery, alcohol, hospitals, orphanages, and the role of women.
There were temperance societies trying to combat alcoholism. There were women's suffrage societies. There were prison societies to try to improve the conditions of the prison. There were societies to provide more humane treatment for the insane. There were societies to attend to racial conflict and so forth. It was a great year of reform.
These movements brought together unlikely friends, preachers and slaves, former drunkards and school teachers, rich and poor, all with a burning desire for change. One of the first places they looked for national salvation was through the salvation of their own souls.